pay restraint now work any better? And relations between China and Britain seem to get worse by the day. How serious is the developing crisis over Hong Kong? Sir Michael Palliser, head of the China-Britain Trade Group and former head of the Diplomatic Service, joins us straight from dinner with China's senior Vice Premier. The former minister, whose dramatic change of story brought about the collapse of the Matrix Churchill case and thus precipitated the Arms for Iraq scandal, is to be investigated by the Metropolitan Police. The Crown Prosecution Service wants the police to look into what it calls inconsistencies in the evidence of Alan Clark. This latest twist in an increasingly complex scandal came after an earlier angry spat in the Commons. John Smith accused John Major of misleading Parliament over changes to rules governing exports to Iraq brought in 1988, an allegation the Prime Minister rebutted as scurrilous with no basis in fact. The two clashed over the scope of the inquiry ordered by the government.
In the Commons, Labour continue to keep up the pressure on the government over the scandal. John Smith accused Mr Major of misleading Parliament over Britain's role in arming Iraq. The Prime Minister looked visibly irritated and at one stage accused Mr Smith of being extremely silly.
The suggestion that ministers misled the House is a serious charge, a scurrilous charge, and it has no basis whatsoever in fact. It is typical of the charges we have had from the Labour Party before. It is typical of the charges over BCCI, which were utterly unfounded, and which the right honourable gentleman and his colleagues have never apologised for making.
The Prime Minister has laid the responsibility for much of the government's embarrassment on the former Minister Alan Clark. Mr Major said he was told by Mr Clark in December 1990 that there were no grounds for accusations that the government had broken guidelines on exports to Iraq. At that time, Mr Clark himself went on the record.
I never did anything of the kind, and the whole article is highly defamatory and incorrect.
So you didn't give a nod and a wink?
Certainly, I've never given a nod or wink to anyone in my life.
In a statement before the trial, Mr Clark stuck to that line. He said he'd advised the defendants to make full and frank disclosures in their application for a licence to export machine tools to Iraq. But the three defendants walked free from court last week after Mr Clark went into the witness box and gave verbal evidence contradicting his statement. He admitted he'd met the managing director of Matrix Churchill, Paul Henderson, in January 1988 and advised him to emphasise the peaceful uses of his machine tools in a licence application. The prosecution that had cost £3 million was abandoned. This afternoon, the Crown Prosecution Service put out this statement. Having considered the papers passed to us by HM Customs and Excise, the Crown Prosecution Service has asked the Metropolitan Police to carry out inquiries relating to the inconsistencies in the evidence of Mr Alan Clark. Tonight, neither the defendants nor the opposition accepted that Mr Clark should alone take the blame. Documentary evidence used in the men's defence, and since leaked to the media, showed ministers agreed to relax the strict guidelines on exports to Iraq in late 1988. In a briefing this afternoon, Downing Street confirmed that the guidelines were changed, but Parliament wasn't told at the time. During the Iraq-Iran war, the rules said exports should be banned if they significantly enhance the capability of either side. After December 1988, exports were only banned if they were of direct and significant assistance to either country in offensive operations in breach of the ceasefire. Mr Major can now expect the barrage of questioning over the Iraq affair to continue undiminished as Scotland Yard's investigation carries on in parallel with the Scott inquiry.
So the government is now becoming entangled with the law on a number of fronts. Not only does one of its ministers at the time face prosecution, but the Scott inquiry will also inquire whether present ministers acted correctly in signing public interest immunity certificates. These would have suppressed the evidence that led to the acquittal of the directors of Matrix Churchill had the trial judge not chosen to override them. Ministers have said they signed the certificates on the advice of the Attorney General, who said this duty cannot be waived. As Lord Justice Scott begins his deliberations, it isn't just Mr Clark who's under legal scrutiny. With us now is the Chairman of the Bar Council, Lord Williams of Mostyn QC, Gareth Williams. What is the nature of the potential offence which may have conceivably have been committed by Mr Clark?
I think there are two. Every criminal case starts with a statement from a prosecution witness, which is what Mr Clark was. You have to sign that statement promising that you've told the truth in it and haven't willfully misled or said anything untruthful. And you acknowledge that if you're in breach of that duty, you can be subject to fine or imprisonment. So that's the first possible charge. The second one, I think, would be attempting to pervert the course of justice. I think the first is more likely.
And is that's like perjury, the first one, is it?
It's not dissimilar. It's specifically making a statement which you don't believe to be true or know is not true.
What's the potential penalty in either case?
Fine or imprisonment.
For how long?
It could be a matter of months or years. I would have thought for a first offender, more likely not to be imprisonment.
Of course, had he perjured himself, none of this would he'd never have been subject to this investigation, would he?
Perjury would mean that he had lied on oath, and I don't think anyone suggests that. The sentence for perjury would be more severe. He might well have been found out if he had perjured himself, of course.
Now, can you help us with this question of public interest immunity? Ministers involved have said they had no choice but to sign these certificates. Did they have a choice?
I believe they did. They acted on the advice of the attorney, which I think was proper advice. But at the end of the day, a minister in our constitution is finally responsible. He must read the documents himself and see whether or not the public interest is damaged by disclosure.
So the final decision lies with the minister concerned?
In my opinion, yes.
Although the attorney appears to suggest that they, having received that advice, they couldn't do anything but follow it.
Subject to the contents of the documents. I think the attorney's advice was correct, namely, if the documents are within a class that would damage the public interest by disclosure, you must take the point. But I don't believe that simply sheltering behind advice is sufficient these days.
Now, when ministers say that in signing the documents they were not necessarily seeking to suppress them, but to pass responsibility for their disclosure to the trial judge, are they strictly accurate there?
They are literally correct, but part of this, I think, is the curse of secrecy, obsessive secrecy, that riddles our country. They are literally correct in passing the decision to the judge. Fortunately, we had an independent-minded judge who, in effect, quashed the certificates.
But it could equally well have gone the other way with a different kind of judge.
Quite easily. It's a matter of discretion and judgment for the individual judge, which is another worrying thing from the lawyer's point of view.
From a lawyer's point of view, do you get the impression that ministers have been entirely frank on this subject?
No.
Why not?
I think the lawyer's point of view is as good as yours and the same as yours. I don't believe that anyone believes that ministers have been frank on this.
Lord Williams, thank you.
Thank you.
British ministers and ex-ministers can take comfort of a sort from the fact that their counterparts in other countries are also accused of helping the Iraqi war machine. In the United States, a parallel story has unfolded. The trial of a Georgia bank manager has lifted the lid on what seems to have been not merely a conspiracy to supply arms to Iraq, but to cover up the fact that such supplies had been shipped in the first place. Peter Marshall reports from Atlanta now, Georgia, on how the American connection is leading to further allegations about Britain's role in the affair.
Atlanta is America's fastest growing city. It's a symbol of the newly affluent American South. It'll be host to the next Olympics. Atlanta is also the place where the greatest international arms scandal for years, Iraqgate, came to light.
The Justice Department has been corrupted, or elements of the Justice Department. The State Department knew what was happening. The Commerce Department knew what was happening. The Agriculture Department knew what was happening. And George Bush knew what was happening.
The U.S., the UK, and other Western governments have engaged in a massive cover-up of their policy towards Iraq. It's a very embarrassing policy that ended in war and the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives.
The offices of the Banca Nazionale del Lavoro, BNL, are situated in one corner of one floor of a tower block in downtown Atlanta. It was from here that the network of Iraq's illegal arms deals with the West were financed. The conspiracy was nothing if not international. It involved a bank owned by the Italian government, with its branch here in the southern United States, lending billions of dollars so that Iraq could buy arms from America, Britain, and anybody else who'd sell them. It was, of necessity, a secret scheme, so nobody told the Atlanta FBI or two of the bank's employees, who complained about billions of dollars going unrecorded. The FBI duly raided, and the game was up. Iraqgate was about to enter the language. BNL's Atlanta manager, Christopher Dragul, was arrested, and for 3 years now the American government has insisted he and he alone was responsible for the $5 billion fraud. But over the months their case has been falling apart. The original judge, Marvin Shube, resigned, claiming the government was obstructing the course of justice. The Attorney General, William Barr, now looks likely to have to concede the demands to appoint a special prosecutor, independent of the Justice Department. That will be a victory for one of Georgia's most celebrated defence lawyers. Bobby Lee Cook has represented the Rockefellers. Now he's working for Dragul. He says the former BNL manager was told by the American government to lie about what was really going on at BNL, to take the blame himself and cover up the role of America and that of other Western governments.
Before I became involved in the case, officials of the United States Department of Justice and of the Agriculture Department who were investigating BNL in Atlanta were asking him to lie and to perjure himself.
What were they telling him to do?
They wanted him to say that no one in the bank in Rome knew what was going on with reference to these loans, and that no one in the American government knew what was going on with reference to these loans. And he decided that he was not going to do that. And it was good judgment on his behalf.
You're suggesting that the bank was set up in Atlanta for the specific purpose of financing these illegal arms deals with Iraq through Britain, Italy, Germany, and America.
Oh, of course. That is definitely my opinion. There would have been no other reason, as I see it, to have established a branch bank of BNL out of Rome, Italy, and Atlanta, Georgia.
Large chunks of Saddam's nuclear program, discovered and filmed by UN inspectors, were funded by BNL in Atlanta. The continuing investigations of the bank's affairs have uncovered a wealth of evidence of American government involvement, both in the funding and in providing the technology. A Pentagon memo from 1985 refers to a CIA report that the Iraqis were actively trying for a nuclear bomb and that they'd been less than honest in their intended use of imports. The Iraqis themselves provided the Commerce Department in Washington with page after page detailing the equipment inside 76 different laboratories. These reveal that they were testing missile fuels, flight behavior, and air patterns. The Pentagon reported that this was clear evidence of a missile program, yet American exports continued.
Even after they'd been told by the Pentagon, even after they had a list of the laboratories in their hand, and even after the CIA was reporting that the Iraqis were going for the bomb. This is all documentary evidence. And they still, in light of that, in the teeth of those warnings, recommended approval. One case here is for some high-tech machine tools to the Bader General Establishment. The Bader General Establishment was in charge of making centrifuges for nuclear weapon production in Iraq.
Throughout the 1980s, some elements in the Pentagon were apparently viewing this trade with dismay. Stephen Bryan was Assistant Undersecretary for Defense. He says his complaints were repeatedly slapped down.
I think the attitude of the administration was that we don't really want to know about this. Our job is to support Saddam Hussein, to help him out.
Now, out of government, he's been commissioned by the Pentagon to inquire into what exactly went on. He's well placed. From personal experience, he knows of many such deals. For example, there was the sale of zirconium pyrotechnic pellets from America to Iraq via the Cardoan Company in Chile.
There was a licensing official in the Commerce Department who blew the whistle on it and complained and held up the second license of many licenses, trying to say that this had some application in the nuclear area, because zirconium can also be used for cladding fuel rods for nuclear reactors. And so he blocked it on that basis. That led to quite a protest from the company, and particularly from Chile, from the U.S. Embassy in Chile, who heard from Cardone, who said, I'm not getting my supplies, my licenses are blocked. And the U.S. Embassy said, this is a wonderful man and a marvelous fellow and doing these great things, and how come this is being held up? And so the result was the license was approved, and subsequent licenses were approved, and tons of this stuff flowed.
After the raid on BNL's Atlanta branch in 1989, there seems to have been an international diplomatic panic. The American embassy in Rome reported the concern of the Italian government. Shortly after that, the CIA noted that officials of the bank in Rome were involved in the scandal. All grist to the mill of the hard-nosed Congressional Banking Committee, who've now gathered intelligence information implicating governments on both sides of the Atlantic, with Britain and America apparently in cahoots.
We have a lot of information on Matrix Churchill's operations and the procurement network's operations. We are not allowed to spy on British companies, and British intelligence is not allowed to spy on us. Yet we have tons of information on British companies, so it's obvious that we got the information from the British. And that starts going back as far as at least 1988 that we've seen.
So you're saying the United States and Britain were working together on this all along?
Definitely. Coordinated effort to gather intelligence on Iraq's procurement activities.
Evidence of British involvement became public here in 1990 with the customs raid on Matrix Churchill subsidiary plant in Ohio. Funded by BNL, Matrix Churchill ran what was in effect a procurement service for Iraq in the United States. The British position has infuriated Bill Triplett, a senior counsel to the Senate. 3 years ago, he says, the British embassy in Washington categorically assured him Britain wasn't involved in Iraqi arms deals.
Basically, we're furious for two reasons. One, because of the special relationship, we rely a lot on what the British tell us, and we expect to have a reasonable relationship. I am not sure about the future of that relationship, at least as far as I'm concerned personally. That's number one. And number two, it had a substantive effect because it stopped the investigation in its tracks, and Matrix Churchill had one more year to ship the wrong things to Iraq and further to destroy documents if, in fact, that's what it was doing.
And there's a further twist. The Georgia lawyer, on a visit to the Matrix Churchill trial in London, was astonished to hear that Paul Henderson, the company's boss, had secretly been granted immunity from prosecution by the American Justice Department.
The American government had him here, the Justice Department, to give testimony before the grand jury in Atlanta.
What happened?
And he received immunity. The American government gave him a grant of immunity from any prosecution here.
What does that mean to you, then, do you think?
Well, it certainly means to me that from the very beginning, that the American government knew that Mr. Henderson was working hand in glove with MI6, and that MI6 from the beginning was working hand in glove with our intelligence agencies, and that there was a transference, if you please, of information back and forth across the Atlantic.
So what a tangled web. The UN inspectors have been left searching high and low for evidence of Iraq's nuclear and chemical programs, which were provided courtesy of America, Britain, and most points west. What's more, the American government even helped the Iraqis with a sort of advanced training course in how to blow things up.
Well, in 1989, the United States, the Department of Energy, the Department of Defense, offered the opportunity to 3 Iraqis from a laboratory to come over and learn the most recent techniques of detonation. How do you set off shaped charges, which are used to detonate nuclear weapons? And the Pentagon and the Department of Energy checked with the State Department to see whether it would be okay to let these guys come. The State Department said, fine. Maybe they want to use it for mining. We don't know, but it's okay. These 3 Iraqis wound up coming from a laboratory that actually supplied the first parts for Saddam's bomb.
The world has paid dearly for the trade known as Iraq-gate. 2 Gulf Wars were price enough. Now, every day there are new allegations that the Western democracies spent the 1980s arming Saddam and the 1990s covering it up.
Peter Marshall. Now, relations between London and Peking, usually a mixture of ambiguity and opacity, are becoming increasingly strained, to the point some experts say have been...
They could be programmed to make almost anything.
You could do a pump shaft for a pump in a washing machine. You could do the front axle on an automotive component. And you could produce shell casings in the munition industry.
Because of the government's guidelines on exports to the Gulf, Henderson had to get a Department of Trade license to fill orders for Iraq. His machines were destined for the NASA factory and the Hatin engineering establishment outside Baghdad. At the height of the Iran-Iraq war, the orders were for machines to make artillery shells.
– 1 – 2 – 3 – 4 – 5 – 6 – 7 – 8 – 9 – 10 – 11 – 12 – 13 – 14 – 15 – 16 – 17 – 18 – 19 – 20 – 21 – 22 – 23 – 24 – 25 – 26 – 27 – 28 – 29 – 30 – 31 – 32 – 33 – 34 – 35 – 36 – 37 – 38 – 39 – 40 – 41 – 42 – 43 – 44 – 45 – 46 – 47 – 48 – 49 – 50 – 51 – 52 – 53 – 54 – 55 – 56 – 57 – 58 – 59 – 60 – 61 – 62 – 63 – 64 – 65 – 66 – 67 – 68 – 69 – 70 – 71 – 72 – 73 – 74 – 75 – 76 – 77 – 78 – 79 – 80 – 81 – 82 – 83 – 84 – 85 – 86 – 87 – 88 – 89 – 90 – 91 – 92 – 93 – 94 – 95
We stated that the end user was the NASA General Establishment, we stated that the end user was the Houthine General Establishment, and we stated that the type of company was a general engineering establishment.
Why didn't you state that they were for military use?
Never thought there was a need to do that. The end use was not of a key factor to us, it was the technology of the machine we were exporting.
In those days, Henderson was merely selling to Iraq, not spying on Saddam. But the men in this building were spying. They ran MI5, the Domestic Intelligence Service.
Secret. P.O. Box 500, London, November 1987. Source 528 has been able to provide details of the Iraqi contracts with UK companies. Source is in no doubt that all these tools will be used in Iraq for the production of armaments.
Source 528 was Matrix Churchill's export manager. Unbeknown to Henderson, this man would regularly meet an MI5 handler.
I would arrive at the hotel at the pre-arranged time. We never met in the reception area. I would go to the reception desk, ask for his name, his cover name, the room number, and I'd go to the room.
MI5 relied on Mark Guttridge to report back what he saw on sales trips. He'd got access to a high-security factory in Iraq where they had problems with their lathes.
It did prove rather difficult to get into. The security was very tight.
Once you got past the security, what did you see? What was going on?
Well, they allowed me to see the whole of the machine shop because they had to point out the particular tooling problem they were experiencing.
And what was going on? What were they making?
They were making 155 shells.
MI5 alerted Whitehall to Guttridge's discoveries. That sounded alarm bells at the DTI. After all, the guidelines were in place, but they'd approved the export licenses. One of Henderson's managers received an urgent call.
We received a telephone call from Tony Steadman of the Department of Trade and Industry, who had informed him that the licences were to be revoked, and that mainly because they'd found out that these machines were going into munition-making factories.
When Guttridge heard the news, he was worried it must have been his information that had been leaked to the DTI. His MI5 case officer recorded his concern.
14th of December, 1987. I told Guttridge that his information would not have reached the DTI. He outlined the penalties to be paid by UK companies if the licences are revoked. After this very tricky period, with my nose growing ever longer, Guttridge accepted that our meetings could not be held responsible.
We always had an understanding that I helped them voluntarily, unpaid, and it was always on the basis that it must never affect my business. That was always an understanding, a strict understanding. If the licenses were going to be revoked, the company were going to lose a lot of business. People's jobs were at stake here.
Worried about losing his intelligence source, the MI5 officer said he'd take action. Anxious for different reasons were the other machine tool manufacturers, but they needn't have worried about jobs or intelligence. A cover-up was already being planned. At the DTI, they'd reconsidered.
Keeping quiet seems the sensible option.
At the Foreign Office,
the companies should be urged to ship as fast as they can. If it becomes public knowledge, deliveries would have to stop.
At the Ministry of Defence,
the loss of the contracts would be devastating for the companies.
Alan Clark was then Trade Minister at the DTI. Because the machine tool manufacturers were concerned they'd all have their licenses revoked for trade with Iraq, he agreed to meet them in his office. The events at that meeting 4 years ago lit the fuse of the Arms for Iraq scandal, which exploded this week. Despite the intelligence reports, Clark made it clear he would turn a blind eye if their machines were destined for military purposes.
Thank you for coming. Gentlemen, we're not going to waste time. You know what the machines are used for. We know what the machines are used for. So, let's get on with the meeting.
Those words are still engraved on my mind. I believe what Alan Clark was saying to us was that it would stress the peaceful aspect of the dual-use technology. In other words, put more emphasis on the civilian aspect of the use of the machine more than the military aspect.
But these contracts in question were military.
They were for producing munition components, yes.
So what he was saying, as was suggested in court, was that the suggestion was that to avoid trouble you should be economical with the truth.
Basically, yes.
With the long war suspended and a fragile ceasefire in place, Saddam Hussein embarked on a quest to rebuild his war machine. The ceasefire gave the British government an opportunity to relax the Foreign Secretary's strict guidelines on arms-related exports, a move never disclosed to Parliament. Ministers and British manufacturers flocked to Baghdad, among them Paul Henderson of Matrix Churchill. His export manager Mark Guttridge was there too. Saddam wanted to rule over a superpower with its own armaments industry. He was attracted to the high technology at Matrix Churchill, where Iraqi visitors were always welcome.
Above all else, the company prides itself on its ability to respond to the needs of individual customers, an ability based on a unique product range.
Iraq liked the company so much they bought control of it, although they kept on Henderson and the British managers. Its new chairman, Dr. Safar al-Habobi, installed himself in London in a £1 million house in Hampstead. British intelligence, MI6, knew Habobi as a top official in Saddam's weapon procurement network. To spy on him, MI6 recruited Paul Henderson himself.
They were concerned, and their main concerns were related to nuclear, missiles and chemical warfare. So they wanted to find out which companies they were getting involved in, which companies they were buying interests in, and what type of equipment they were purchasing, and for which factories that equipment was going into in Iraq.
For 2 years, Henderson reported back to MI6.
When I arrived at Euston Station, my contact was there to meet me. We took a chauffeur-driven Ford Granada car and travelled to the safe house, which was off the Mall. The whole purpose of this meeting was to verify information that they'd assimilated from me, from other sources, regarding projects, particular projects in Baghdad. And to my recollection, apart from my contact, there was 4 other people in the room who I was introduced to, but only by first names.
Following trips to Baghdad, Henderson supplied blueprints and plans. He was the first to alert them to the soon-to-be notorious supergun. Codenamed Project Babylon, the supergun was planned to work with rockets machined by Matrix. MI6 files show too how Henderson told British intelligence of Saddam's nuclear purchases. Scud missiles were being improved to terrorise Saddam's neighbours. Some in the West eventually became worried about Saddam's military aggression and his murderous use of chemical weapons to crush Kurdish resistance to his rule in his own country. In mid-89, the Foreign Office became unhappy about new applications from Matrix Churchill to sell lathes to Iraq. John Major had just taken over as Foreign Secretary. The Foreign Office now wanted to block the licenses. They met resistance from the DTI and the MOD. Using civil servants' briefings and letters between ministers, we've reconstructed the arguments at the meeting to decide whether or not to issue those licenses. Junior Foreign Office Minister William Waldegrave was there. So was Alan Clark, by now at the MOD. Lord Trefgarne from the DTI led off the debate. The clash took place in his room at the House of Lords.
As far as I see it, there's no problem in granting Matrix Churchill the export licenses. Indeed, it would be quite wrong to deny them. After all, this is still a British company. The Iraqis don't have any say in its management, and there's no real proof that the equipment will be used for military purposes. The company could well go out of business if we turn them down.
Well, obviously I don't want to see any unnecessary losses of jobs in this country, but you're quite wrong to suggest that the Iraqis have no say in its running. It's 95% Iraqi-owned, for goodness sake. My fear is it's simply another part of the Iraqi procurement network in this country, and we cannot ignore what the purpose of that procurement is. Iraq's chemical warfare production, its missile development, and possibly even its nuclear weapons research. It's all well documented. I do accept that these machine tools may well have an innocent civilian purpose, but intelligence reports suggest that in the past they have been used for the manufacture of munitions, which is why I'm sure you'll all welcome the survey that our intelligence people are going to be doing into British companies that export to Iraq, who may be part of the procurement strategy.
Welcome it. I think it's outrageous, and I tend to put a stop to it. What on earth does the intelligence service think it's doing, trying to seek ways of damaging our trade surplus in this way? This is all part of the same old nonsense. We should be getting rid of these defence sale guidelines, not firming them up. They are not linked to our security. They're simply as a sop to the liberals in the House and in the media. Our helping the Iraqis along a bit is not going to make them start up the war again against Iran.
I couldn't agree more.
I take your points, but it is not for us to decide the future of these guidelines. They are still government policy, and they have to be observed.
Well, there is perhaps a case to be made for the guidelines, but are you seriously suggesting that these lathes from Matrix Churchill are of any real importance?
It's not just this equipment I'm worried about. It's the company's involvement in this whole Iraqi procurement web.
Look, we've already been over this ground.
If you both feel so strongly about it, then I may be willing to withdraw my objections. But what I want in return is that the intelligence people continue their survey, that the sales guidelines remain in place. Most important of all, that if there's any flack from the press about these lathes going through, that your department will deal with it.
Agreed.
Agreed.
9 days later, in a written answer, the then Prime Minister, Mrs. Thatcher, claimed to the Commons that the Howe guidelines still stood.
Supplies of British defence equipment to Iraq and Iran continue to be governed by the guidelines introduced in 1985.
But Mrs. Thatcher never published the internal intelligence survey raised by William Waldegrave at that meeting in the Lords. It was to conclude,
UK Limited is helping Iraq to set up a major indigenous arms industry.
9 months later, to the British government's surprise, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. Astonishingly, export licenses for machines to make arms were still being issued on the eve of the invasion, including machines from Matrix Churchill.
I had a telephone conversation with Michael Culligan of the DTI, who told me that the licenses had been cleared, and as a result of that he was writing a letter to the company to advise them. So we were within 24 hours.
So within 24 hours of the invasion, the DTI was still telling you, carry on selling?
Yes.
These are the machines to make shell fuses which Henderson was still crating up ready to ship when the war intervened. Britain found itself joining the Allies engulfed in the war against Iraq. Munitions were being fired at Allied forces which the British government had encouraged machine tool manufacturers to supply.
I particularly don't like to see anybody killed, and I think wars are the worst thing. But in the industry that we're in, it is an inevitable consequence of the machine tools that we manufacture.
Henderson, his company and his licensors were investigated by Customs and Excise. They said the company had illegally concealed the military purpose of these fuse component machines bound for Iraq. Henderson and two fellow managers were charged just as the Gulf War ended. The company had collapsed and they faced up to 7 years in jail. Bearing in mind his secret intelligence work, Henderson was astounded.
If the Iraqis had found out that I had provided information to British intelligence, yes, I could have ended up in an Iraqi jail, but I never expected that I would end up in a British jail.
Henderson had now become an embarrassment to his MI6 handlers at Century House.
After my arrest, I did try to contact them by telephone, but my calls were never ever returned.
So they left you out in the cold, as the phrase is?
Effectively, yes.
And it got even worse. Alan Clark was now denying he'd ever encouraged manufacturers to be less than truthful in their licence applications. In a witness statement to customs investigators preparing their case against Henderson, he testified of the meeting in 1988.
At the meeting, I was advised by the delegation that the machine tools were for general engineering purposes. The advice I gave was based upon the assumption that the exports were intended for civil application.
The trial was approaching. Henderson had no chance to prove the truth without access to secret Whitehall papers. They would have shown how much the government actually knew about businessmen's links with British intelligence. 4 government ministers signed public interest immunity certificates, saying it was against the national interest to reveal any of these documents. The government said they had to protect intelligence sources. But one intelligence source, Mark Guttridge, was in fact struggling with a moral dilemma. He'd been a friend of Henderson's for 30 years, and he decided to break his vow of silence. Mark Guttridge revealed in a defence statement that Henderson's claims about intelligence work were all true. This led the judge to order disclosure of the government documents.
I felt a certain amount of loyalty, particularly to my MI5 case officer and of course to my country. But the decision I had to make when I examined my conscience was loyalty to the country on one hand, and on the other hand loyalty to a friend in fact of 30 years. I felt that the charges and the fact that they'd been arrested and charged was absolutely ridiculous, ludicrous.
Why?
Why, yes, when the government already knew.
Alan Clark certainly knew. Under cross-examination, he abandoned his earlier statement and told the truth. The customs case collapsed. Paul Henderson, the spy they left out in the cold, was vindicated. Now the police have launched an investigation into the minister and his statements about arms for Iraq. And the government's been forced to set up an inquiry under Lord Justice Scott.
I hope a lot more comes out at the Scott inquiry. All the ministers weren't called into the witness box at our trial at the Old Bailey. Mark Guttridge wasn't called, I wasn't called. So there is a lot more still to be revealed.
That edition of This Week replaced The Vendetta on Bergerac's Island, a report on a...
Cardone were not known to me as a controversial company, and within Matrix Churchill they were not discussed as a controversial company. There was never any question of keeping the contract quiet. If anyone had have asked me what I was doing, I would have told them that we were tooling up machine tools for munitions manufacture in Iraq.
Steve Britton was Seeger's boss. Back at the now almost deserted Matrix site, he's preparing to auction surplus equipment and close down a factory that 2 years ago was preparing for the massive Cardone order. At the time, he had no worries about controversy or problems with export licenses.
Matrix Churchill was supplying 2 and 3 series machines, its own manufacture, which the DTI ruled were not licensable in the particular instance.
We didn't need licenses for them at all?
That's right.
And did the DTI know or want to know what the machines were going to be used for when they said that licenses weren't required?
The DTI would have known from the applications, which were filled out in line with their requirements and their guidelines, what the equipment was for, yes. The equipment...
They'd have known it was going to make fuses for armaments?
In the case of the Cardone project, I think that's well known that is what that project was for.
In fact, the DTI had been aware of official concern at the Cardone connection as early as April '89. Replying to a query from Customs about matrix supplies to Iraq, they made it clear, "We are not happy about the Chilean involvement." Even so, the DTI not only granted export licenses, but provided insurance cover for the deal under their Export Credit Guarantee Department. Cardone was paid by the Iraqis in oil, and once he'd sold it on the spot market, he paid Matrix Churchill. When the Export Credit Guarantee Department provided cover, they knew the contract was with Cardone, and they knew the nature of his business: manufacturer and distributor of explosives, chemical substances and military vehicles. His commercial morality was described as good. With ECGD cover, the deal went ahead. Matrix were paid 20% deposit, a further 70% when the machine tools were delivered, but never got all of the final 10% that should have been paid when the machines were commissioned.
We hadn't got the final commissioning payment, you're quite right, but because we hadn't fully commissioned them, we wouldn't expect that. But the payment...
And why hadn't they been commissioned?
Purely time. We'd got to the point where Iraq walked into Kuwait and we walked out of Iraq.
But it does mean that ECGD, and therefore presumably the British taxpayer, were exposed because of this.
I suppose that's right. Yes, I suppose that's right.
Do you know how much money is outstanding?
Not off the top of my head.
But what sort of sum would we be talking about, do you think?
It'll be several £1,000s.
The Export Credit Guarantee Department has since been privatised. Tonight, a spokesman confirmed that this is the position and said, "We are considering the claim." The ECGD would not discuss the sum involved. When Customs paid their first visit here on June the 20th, 1990, they made it very clear that they were interested in the contracts with Cardone, which involved machines like this one, and were keeping an eye on other firms in Britain dealing with his company. Now, with the announcement that Lord Justice Scott's inquiry is to be widened, there are growing pressures for a further investigation into the links between Britain, Iraq and the Chilean arms manufacturer. Tony Moyle's son Jonathan was murdered in Chile in March 1989. He'd been bound and hanged. He was a former RAF trainee pilot who now edited the specialist Defence Helicopter World. According to his father, he was conducting research into Cardone and the links with arms sales to Iraq.
Well, I would like to see the terms of reference of the inquiry widened to take into account the circumstances of my son's death, because I think that would, in its own way, shed light or further light on the other companies that were involved, because, as I've said before, in my opinion, and in many people's opinion, the Matrix Churchill affair is the tip of the iceberg.
If the Scott inquiry does decide to follow up the Matrix Cardone links, it could perhaps include a check on the records of Coventry's hotels. According to one Matrix employee, both Iraqis and Chilean employees of Cardone were staying in Coventry in '89 and '90 so they could oversee the Matrix Churchill order for Cardone and learn how to operate the lathes.
There was 90% of the time a representative from Cardone in Coventry, and at one time there were 3 or 4 people there from Cardone.
And from the Iraqi side?
From the Iraqi side there were only really people that were actually going to operate the machine tools. So that would be people who would be programming them, operating them, maintenance and electrical engineers.
In Coventry, it seems the Cardone connection and the production of machine tools for the Iraqi arms industry